My sister has been missing for almost 5 days now. She's got a 13-year-old daughter, and we are worried sick.
There was more to this than just a missing persons case.
There's no way. She's not leaving her daughter.
That was very concerning to me.
We're certain that some type of foul play has been involved.
CCTV played a massive role in this case. We knew that they were lying because of the CCTV.
All I want to do is find her, and I want to give you a chance to dig yourself out of the hole.
37-year-old Marilee Cox Lafferty prepares for a 900-mile road trip from her home in California to Utah.
I met Marilee when we were teenagers. We went to a counseling group together. She was a misfit, and she was funny, and she was hardworking.
Marilee hopes to rekindle a romance with an old flame.
I knew the person that she was seeing was Rob Willis. She had known him since she was very young, about 16.
Honey, are you ready?
Marilee's 13-year-old daughter, Shayna, is coming with her.
They sure were always together. Very rarely were they separated. She was a really good mom.
Marilee wants to build a better future for herself after a lifetime of challenges.
Over the years, Marilee struggled with a bunch of battles. She was very open about them as well. She struggled with anxiety and depression and addiction.
She was a severe alcoholic. They said that she would have died if she wouldn't have quit drinking.
From that point on, after she went through recovery, I was so proud of Marilee when she had done the work that she needed to do to get sober.
That's a good girl. Come on.
Her service dog, Coco, will be traveling by her side.
She was epileptic. She would black out and have full-on grand mal seizures. They had her on a lot of different medications.
So she got Coco, a dog that could help if something happened to her. Marilee was just trying to figure out how she could both live with this condition and also be the sole provider for her daughter. That was her #1 priority.
This is Christy. Hi, ma'am. My name's Shawnee Weissman, and my sister has been missing for almost 5 days now. The last she was in the Logan, Utah area. She's got a 13-year-old daughter, and we are worried sick.
The person that reported Marilee missing was her friend, who she referred to as kind of her sister. Her name is Shawnee.
Does she live here, or? No, she lives in California. She was visiting friends there in Logan, Utah. I don't know the address. And you don't know what she was doing here? She was helping a friend move. Her friend brought her daughter to me in Idaho.
Shawnee reported that Marilee had a daughter that had been taken to Shawnee by Rob Willis. Shawnee was worried about Marilee because she had a past with alcohol and drugs, and she was worried that Marilee had relapsed.
We've got missing persons.
When this was passed to Logan PD, this was given to me to be the lead investigator into the missing persons case for Marilee Cox Lafferty.
We have somebody that's possibly under the influence and driving a vehicle on the roadways. We entered Marilee into a nationwide database for missing persons. Same thing for her vehicle, a gold Toyota Camry with California license plates.
We're gonna need to get statements from the family.
Detectives speak with Marilee's brother, Daryl, to get more information.
I had spoken with Shawnee. She said that Rob and Marilee had an argument. She had taken a handful of Klonopin and moonshine and left in her car, left her daughter and everything.
She would never run off like this.
I immediately felt like there was more to this than just a missing persons case. We had heard that Marilee had taken some drugs and alcohol and just disappeared.
Marilee had reportedly been sober for 9 years.
After rehab, she never touched anything ever again. There's no way. She's not grabbing a bottle, and she's not leaving her daughter. She was very protective of her.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
The thing that really stuck out to me initially was that her daughter was left behind. That didn't make a lot of sense to me. That was very concerning to me.
Investigators focused next on the man Marilee drove to Utah to visit, Rob Willis.
Marilee had come from California with her daughter to visit Rob Willis here in Hiram, which is a town just south of Logan.
Detective Woods, you Rob Willis?
That's me.
Rob told us that Marilee had come to help him move stuff into his new house. He said that she had been there on August 17th and August 18th. She had her daughter with her and her dog. At some point, they got into an argument about their relationship.
Rob said that Marilee wanted to be intimate with him, and he declined. He and Marilee had been arguing all night, and the argument continued in the morning. They went to Shane's house, where they dropped off Marilee's daughter.
Who's Shane?
Rob tells detectives that Shane Miles is his friend and co-worker.
The argument that happened between he and Marilee was outside Shane's apartment in the parking lot. Marilee had reportedly threatened to drink a bunch of alcohol and take her medication in order to end her life.
He said Marilee was very angry. She was yelling at him.
Rob and Shane had to go to work, and they were going to be late, so they left.
Whose car did you leave in?
Mine. It's right there.
And they both left for work in Rob's vehicle, which is a green Isuzu Trooper.
Rob says he believed that Marilee, her daughter and Coco, would be gone by the time he and Shane returned from work.
After he left Marilee, he clocked into work at 3:42 p.m., and he was at work until he got off later that night around midnight.
Rob states that he kept getting text messages from her that were of a harassing nature because she was so angry with him.
When they went back to Shane's house, Marilee's vehicle was gone, but that Marilee's daughter was there at Shane's apartment.
They were both very surprised that Marilee's daughter was still there.
The day after Marilee's disappearance on August 19th, Rob took Marilee's daughter up to Idaho to be with Shawnee.
Look at this.
And we noticed that the back window on Rob's vehicle on the driver's side had been broken. It had glass in the back of the vehicle still, but it was kind of like he had covered it with some plastic sheeting.
What happened to the car?
He said he had backed into a tree while camping.
It happened after she disappeared.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Investigators contact Rob's friend, Shane. He volunteers for an interview at the police department.
It's very important that we speak with Shane to see what he has to tell us, to compare that with what Rob is telling us.
All right, Shane, so obviously the reason we're talking to you today is trying to find out what happened to her, okay? Tell me what you know about her.
So I met her on Friday. She came with Rob.
Shane had not met Marilee until she had come to Utah to visit with Rob.
Second time when she come, she stayed out in the car, but then she got out and she come to my door and just hollering, just weird crap like, F you this, F you that.
And when was this?
This was Saturday. The last time when she come to my house, she was outside yelling.
Shane told me that he had told Rob that she can't be acting like that because he'll get in trouble with his landlord and the neighbors. They both stated that the last time they saw her was in the parking lot outside Shane's house, and that they went to work in Rob's green Isuzu Trooper.
Did you go together?
Yeah, we ride together.
Did you see Marilee leave?
No, I was in the house.
His story matched Rob's.
Investigators contact hospitals and local law enforcement to check if Marilee is receiving treatment or in custody.
We found that Marilee had not been to any hospitals in the area, and based on what we could see, she had not been arrested anywhere in the country. So we generated a missing persons flyer that we posted on our Logan City Police Department social media.
Detective Woods.
I received a phone call from one of our lieutenants.
Somebody had located a dog that was wandering around Logan City.
And they started getting messages from Marilee's family members that this dog that we had collected on the 18th of August was Marilee's dog, Coco.
That was concerning because her family reported Marilee would never leave her dog, that dog was always by her side.
Where exactly did you say you found the dog?
That this dog that we had collected was found at TTM Technologies.
TTM Technologies is a company that manufactures electronic components.
There's no real connection to Marilee.
We went to TTM and we asked for surveillance video.
We knew the dog was on film at about 4:42 p.m. What we're hoping to find on this camera is how the dog got to TTM.
Hold it. That's Coco.
We first saw the dog on the camera at 4:42 p.m. on August 18th. The dog is just running around the parking lot like it was by itself. We know Marilee shouldn't have been far away from there, but it didn't seem like Marilee was close by based on the way the dog was acting. A little bit later, the person that had found the dog, we see them pull up in a vehicle, and then we see that person pick up the dog and leave.
Investigators review the footage from TTM's other surveillance cameras to trace Coco's movements before she is found.
At 4:24 p.m., we see the dog sniffing around one of the exterior doors close up to the building.
Do it again.
We still haven't seen anything on camera besides the dog, and so we keep working backwards to see, is there any more surveillance footage that might show something? We see somebody enter the frame wearing a dark shirt, walk towards the door, and someone follows right behind him wearing a white shirt. And as they open the door and enter the building, they both kind of look back.
You can see that it is both Shane and Rob that are on video.
And then just seconds later is when we see the dog follow right behind them. TTM is where Shane Miles and Rob Willis worked. So it was not suspicious that we saw Rob and Shane on the camera footage there at work.
But what was unusual is that Marilee's dog was also on video in proximity to them. That information was crucial. How was the dog located at the workplace for Rob and Shane when Rob had told us that the dog had gone with Marilee?
We start to think maybe Rob and Shane know more information than what they're telling us, and we need to keep looking into that.
Both Rob and Shane told investigators they arrived at work shortly after 3:40 p.m., 1 hour before Coco is found at TTM.
They didn't leave work at all for the duration of their shift until sometime around midnight.
The investigators review the TTM parking lot footage from 3:40 p.m. to pinpoint Rob and Shane's arrival.
That's them.
At 3:46, we see Shane and Rob walking through the parking lot towards the building.
Roll backwards.
We then want to see them enter the parking lot to see what vehicle they're in.
So Rob and Shane had told us that they had come to work in Rob's green Isuzu Trooper, but we didn't see his vehicle. Jump back. At 3:46 p.m., we see a black Ford Mustang.
Can't be sure it's them. Is there a camera on the back lot?
You can follow it on video through the parking lot all the way to the point to where they park.
Play on. Freeze there.
We could see Shane and Rob exit the Mustang.
When we saw that they had arrived in Shane's Mustang and not in Rob's Trooper, we weren't quite sure what to think of that, and so we needed to investigate that further. They both told us they were at work and didn't leave, so we want to watch and see if that's another thing that they're misleading us on.
Fast forward.
We carried on watching it because we knew the dog had arrived at that building.
At 4:06 p.m., we see them leave the parking lot driving Shane's vehicle.
This directly contradicts what they both told us, that they never left work that day.
And so we start to wonder, where are they going?
Approximately 20 minutes after they left work that afternoon, they arrived back in Shane's black Ford Mustang. They park in a different spot this time, and that spot is not actually on camera. So we're not able to see them exit the vehicle at that time. However, within seconds after parking, we do pick them up on surveillance again, walking on TTM property. But this time, the dog is within feet of them.
It is very, very suspicious that they have the dog, but Marilee's nowhere to be seen. We have two people that know something that they're not telling us.
We knew they were lying, and we knew that we had to build a case.
On September 1st, we got some information back from Marilee's cell phone provider showing her most recent cell phone locations.
What have we got? Can you pull that up on a map?
One of the ping locations that we got on Marilee's cell phone was at 1:31 p.m. on August 18th, the day that she went missing. And it showed in the area of Blacksmith Fork Canyon, which is near Rob's residence.
What about the later ping?
One of the other cell phone ping locations we had on Marilee's cell phone was at 2:16 p.m. in the area of 1700 South, the US 8991 highway intersection, which is in Logan, near Shane's apartment. The second cell phone ping was suspicious to us because it was in the city where there is good cell phone service. It's possible that her phone could have died, but Rob also told us that she had been sending him text messages later in the day. And so the fact that 2:16 p.m. is her final cell phone ping is again another inconsistency with what Rob is telling us. It made us believe that something was seriously wrong with her.
The feeling I had was something sinister had happened. I believe Marilee was no longer alive.
Our biggest lead at this time would be Rob and Shane. Up until that point, they've shown that they're not willing to tell us the truth. They're willing to mislead us on certain things. So we start to conduct surveillance on Shane and Rob.
Investigators secure permission to attach a covert GPS tracker to Rob's vehicle.
What we were hoping to obtain by placing the tracker on Rob's vehicle were his movements. Where was he going? Did he have somewhere that might lead us to Marilee? And that's what we really wanted to know. On the evening of September 8th, I was contacted by our on-duty patrol supervisor. He informed me that Marilee's vehicle had been found in Boise, Idaho, near the airport.
We did confirm that her vehicle was located at an extended stay hotel in Boise, Idaho, which from Logan, Utah is about a 5 or a 6 hour drive.
When I got that call, it was actually exhilarating because I knew that we had our vehicle. We had this huge piece of evidence we'd been looking for. Unfortunately, they did not have surveillance of their parking lot. So we don't know how the vehicle got there or who parked it there.
Some of Marilee's family did live in Idaho, not too far from that area. And so we thought maybe she had driven up that way because she had family or friends up there that she wanted to visit. So we talked with Marilee's brother up in Idaho.
When I heard that the vehicle was found, a tinge of hope kind of goes through you, like, okay, maybe she was coming back.
Is there any sign of her yet?
But it didn't add up that she would go back to Boise, she would leave her daughter and her dog even, and then also not try to get in contact with her family.
No, I haven't heard from her at all.
When she'd come to visit in town, she would visit everybody while she was here.
No one had seen her. No one had talked to her.
Investigators received data from the tracker they attached to Rob's vehicle.
On September 7th, we saw that Rob took a trip in his vehicle up into the mountains. That was of interest to us because one of the last cell phone pings from Marilee's cell phone was near the base of one of the canyons.
Marilee's been missing for over 3 weeks. We know there's been no movement on any of her records. The GPS information gave us that he was in the canyon for approximately 3 hours. It can tell us exactly everywhere he stopped.
One of the locations where Rob has stopped at the longest, I think he was in that area for about 23 minutes. So following Rob's trip into the mountains, we took our own trip up there. We found broken glass that looked like it might have been from a vehicle window. Rob told us he'd gone on a camping trip after Marilee's disappearance into the mountains, and that it was on that camping trip that his vehicle window got broken. Maybe it did happen after Marilee disappeared, but maybe it also had something to do with her disappearance, and maybe this is where she was last seen.
We went and thoroughly searched to see if we could find any sign of Marilee or any kind of evidence that would lead us to where she might be. Unfortunately, though, we found no evidence of Marilee. We know that her phone pinged outside Blacksmith Fork Canyon, and then shortly after, it pinged at 1700 South, a known route that Rob used, and that it never had activity again.
One of the businesses along that route was a gas station that had surveillance cameras.
Detectives secure CCTV footage from the gas station for August 18th. They review it at the police department.
The camera angle that we obtained from Maverick mainly shows their parking lot and their gas pumps. But in the very top of the camera angle, you can see the Highway 165. And so we're really only focused on that top part of the camera angle.
It takes a lot of manpower to go through hours of video for what you end up finding is just small sections, maybe seconds or possibly minutes of video you actually need.
At 10:50, we see Rob's Isuzu Trooper travel south.
The driver was wearing a white t-shirt, which is what Rob was wearing as he entered TTM to go to work later on that day.
He's traveling towards Hiram. He lives in Hiram, so it's possible he's going towards his house, but he's also going towards the area near the mouth of Blacksmith Fork Canyon.
We continue to scour the surveillance video for that morning.
Jump back.
At 2:13 p.m., we see Rob's vehicle on the surveillance footage show up. This time it's traveling north on Highway 165 past the Maverick. Whether Marilee is in the vehicle or not, we don't know, but we don't see her vehicle at all in the surveillance footage. We know that Marilee's cell phone pinged at 2:16, about 3 minutes north of where we saw his vehicle on surveillance. We know that most likely her cell phone is in that vehicle.
Punch in on the back of the car.
The quality is not very good, but we're able to see the windows on the vehicle, whether there's a reflection. At 10:50, we can see that the window on his Trooper is intact. At 2:13 p.m., when it goes back the other way, the window looks completely different. You know, there's no reflection at all. We're able to see that the window on his vehicle is now smashed. Rob was lying to us. His vehicle window was damaged and broken the day of Marilee's disappearance.
What happened to Rob's vehicle? Why did this window become broken in this time frame? How did it get broken? We know that just shortly after this, within minutes, Marilee's phone no longer has activity.
We keep watching the surveillance footage to see what else we might find.
Show that again.
And at about 2:55 p.m., we see Rob's vehicle again past the Maverick.
Punch in.
He's traveling south towards his home in Hiram.
We know that he was at work about an hour after that. We know that Rob most likely will pass through again on his way back to Logan, where he goes to work later. At 3:09 p.m., we see Rob's vehicle again travel north past the Maverick.
Go closer.
This time, though, there's something different. We can see that the driver is not wearing a white shirt. The driver is wearing a darker colored shirt.
Stop.
Just a few seconds later, we see a vehicle that looks like a gold Toyota Camry. It looks like Marilee's vehicle, and it passes north, almost directly behind Rob's vehicle. Rob told us that he last saw Marilee and the vehicle in Logan at Shane's apartment.
Punch in.
The thing about that gold Camry that we saw was the driver was wearing a white shirt. So we were very suspicious that Rob was driving Marilee's vehicle at that time. The driver of Rob's vehicle was wearing a dark shirt. We were almost certain that it was Shane driving the vehicle because we had Shane on surveillance later that day wearing a dark shirt.
So where is Marilee?
We didn't see anything that would indicate there was a passenger in either vehicle. However, we couldn't be certain just because of the quality of the video.
Marilee has been missing for 3 weeks. Her friends and family struggle to come to terms with her disappearance.
It was a constant battle where you knew something was very wrong, very bad, but you still want to try to convince yourself that this still could be okay. I was cautious of Rob from the very beginning. She had told me about how he was abusive, both verbal and attempts at physical abuse.
Rob didn't sound right, and she could do 100% better. And then when she came up missing, that was just my gut went straight to that guy did something to her.
At this point in the investigation, we're almost certain that some type of foul play has been involved, that she's no longer alive. We had evidence against Rob, but we also had evidence against Shane, who is most likely to tell us the truth.
Investigators invite Shane to the police department for a second time.
We determined that Shane, if we confronted him with the evidence, that he most likely would help us with the investigation.
So did you guys take Rob's car to work that day?
Rob's vehicle.
Did you ever leave work at all?
No.
Shane again stuck to his story that they left in Rob's green Isuzu Trooper, which we knew was a false statement. He said that they had arrived at work and they had never left, which we knew was a false statement. Shane said that he had never known about Marilee's dog or that she even had a dog, which clearly we knew was a false statement.
I see Shane who's covering for Rob. Because all this stuff you told me today, I can prove that you lied to me.
What do you mean I've lied to you, honestly?
Shane, I know that day that you left TTM. I know that day you were in your vehicle. And I know that you had the dog with you. And that's all on camera.
I began to show still photos from surveillance video to Shane to confront him about his lies.
Whose vehicle was that?
It's my vehicle.
That's the day she went missing.
Okay.
You're in your vehicle. See those times? Those are the times you left work 20 minutes after getting there. And when you returned, Shane?
That's because I go to Paco's Tacos all the time.
You just told me you never left that day. And when you return, her dog is seen on camera with you and Rob.
It was at this point in time that Shane started to crumble.
I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm just scared what to say because I'm scared he's going to do something to me and my kids. I'm being honest with you.
We're going to help you with that.
Shane was obviously scared. I think he was afraid of Rob Willis and what Rob had committed and entangled Shane in. Shane does admit that he helps Rob move Marilee's vehicle to the Paco's Tacos parking lot, just a few blocks west of TTM.
How did he get rid of her car? What did he tell you? And Shane, if you had a part in that, you need to be honest with me right now.
I'm not. I know he took it down somewhere. I don't know where.
I still needed to know how it got up to Boise. Shane denied moving it to Boise.
Who did he say went with him? Because you can't take two cars that far. I already have the car, Shane. Tell me who it is, Shane.
His name's Jordan.
Jordan?
Mm-hmm.
What's Jordan's last name?
I have no idea. I've only met him once.
Shane told us that Jordan had been a coworker with Rob and Shane previously, and that's how he knew him.
Search the database for anybody named Jordan that fits this description.
He did describe some very distinct and unique tattoos that Jordan had on his face.
He's got a rap sheet.
It fits the profile of somebody else that might have been involved in Marilee's disappearance.
It's important at this point in time that we speak to Jordan. Because if Jordan took Marilee's vehicle to Boise, I need to know the circumstances behind that.
Police officers detain Jordan and bring him back to the police department for questioning.
You ever heard the name Marilee Cox Lafferty?
I have never heard that name before.
She's this missing lady that we've been looking for about a month. You recognize her at all?
No, not at all.
Never heard that name at all?
No, I don't even know how I'd be even involved with her.
Okay. Well, she had this little gold Toyota. And that's why you're here.
I asked him about his involvement with Rob Willis.
You ever been up to Boise with him?
I did. I took a trip with him up to Boise.
When was that?
4 weeks ago.
How'd you get there?
I drove his girlfriend's car up there.
Okay. Because right now he's implicated you in a murder.
Implicated me?
By moving her car. And that's why I'm trying to figure out how deeply you're involved.
Rob told him it was a girlfriend's vehicle and he was just gonna go drop it off for him and that Rob would pick him up in Boise. We knew that Rob was the one responsible for Marilee's death and he had used these other people to help cover up his crime. At that point in time, the only thing I could think about was that we needed to pick up Rob. We couldn't have him out in public any longer.
And all I want to do is find her, let her daughter bury her mother. And I want to give you a chance to dig yourself out of this hole.
So you want me to get from Rob anything I can get? Is that what you're asking?
I want you to tell me the truth about everything right now.
Tell you the truth about what?
About what you know.
I don't know anything.
What does Rob
doesn't tell me.
Detective Woods turns up the heat to get Shane to reveal what happened to Marilee.
Where is she, Shane?
She's here.
Where?
Up the canyon somewhere.
Were you there?
No.
Who was with him when he did it?
He's by himself. He was with her.
How'd he kill her?
I think he beat her to death.
Did he say with what?
He just said things like this.
At this point, when Shane tells us this, that's our biggest piece of evidence that we're looking for. Shane led us to a location up Blacksmith Fork Canyon near a pretty remote camping site. I was very hopeful that this would be the end of the investigation.
Shane said that Rob had taken him up there to the specific point and said, she's down there. He believed that this was a scare tactic, that, look, if you tell anybody, this is what's gonna happen to you as well.
In the immediate area of the campsite, there was a tree, and underneath the tree, there was a lot of broken glass.
There was also glass embedded in a tree branch that was the same height, relatively, as Rob's vehicle.
Also in this area was a bracelet that had the scorpion charm on it, and I knew that Marilee was a Scorpio, and so I was pretty certain that was her bracelet.
I went downhill. I'm looking around, I'm trying to find anything, when I get the distinct odor of decomposition. I start moving towards what I see as an unnatural rock formation underneath a tree. We moved one rock and we could see a human foot underneath the rock pile. And we knew that we had found Marilee finally.
I don't think anyone's ever prepared to come across human remains like that. Marilee had been in the mountains, buried up there for about a month.
Marilee was able to be identified positively by her fingerprints.
Marilee's daughter was staying at my house. I just told her that they found her and that she was dead. And she screamed, and she just curled in a ball and cried and cried and cried. It broke my heart so much.
I remember when I got the phone call that they had found her and confirming everything that I didn't want confirmed. That was one of the hardest days of my life, to have to come to reality that she was gone.
I wanted to hold her hand. I wanted to be a big sister, and I wanted to take it away. I would have traded her places in a heartbeat because she fought so hard to be the better person that she was being.
Rob Willis was placed under arrest in Hiram by a SWAT team on the afternoon of September 14th. I knew I had another large task in front of me in trying to get some sort of confession from Rob.
How much do you care about her?
Not that I was thinking about starting a life with her.
Is that before you killed her?
What?
Is that before you killed her, Rob?
I didn't kill her.
You did.
I didn't kill her.
Rob, and we're gonna prove it.
I didn't think he would tell me much. When I tried to confront him, he still deflected.
We found her.
And?
And your DNA is gonna be on her, Rob. I know you killed her, Rob.
I didn't kill her.
I think you just lost control.
When I finally told him that we had recovered Marilee and confronted him and told him that we knew he was responsible, Rob requested an attorney. And at that point, the interrogation ended.
Take me to jail. I'm done.
You can sit down for a bit.
Investigators piece together the events they believe led to Marilee's murder.
Rob and Marilee are arguing about their relationship and then went for a drive and went up into the mountains.
We believe Rob entered the canyon area with Marilee and her dog in Rob's vehicle. At some point in time, there is a fight that occurs. Rob's window became broken.
We're still not certain exactly how Rob killed Marilee, but it was most likely due to some blunt force trauma. Rob had then moved a lot of rocks to cover up her body. Once Rob killed Marilee, he left the mountains.
He returns to Shane's house and he tells Shane what he did.
So he now has to cover up what happened. At that point, Rob realized Marilee's car is at his house.
We then know that him and Shane left Shane's house to go back out to Hiram.
They take Marilee's car, Shane driving Rob's vehicle and Rob driving Marilee's vehicle.
Rob dumps Marilee's car at Paco's Tacos with Marilee's dog, Coco, inside it. Rob and Shane then drive to work in Shane's Mustang.
20 or 30 minutes after arriving, they left TTM on the way to Paco's Tacos to get Marilee's dog from the vehicle.
And they arrived back at TTM a short time later, now with Marilee's dog.
And then the next day, Rob took Marilee's daughter up to be with Shawnee. Rob threatened Jordan to get him to cooperate so that Jordan would drive Marilee's vehicle from Logan up to Boise, Idaho to dispose of it up there, most likely trying to throw us off the track, trying to make us think that Marilee had driven up there to see family. I think Rob did believe that he was going to get away with it because he had tried to dispose of all the evidence. We were not able to prove that Jordan intentionally obstructed the investigation by moving Marilee's vehicle. With Shane, we knew that he had intentionally misled us and obstructed the investigation, but we also had a reasonable belief that Rob had threatened his life and threatened him to participate with the obstruction.
Shane was a very key witness to this homicide investigation and directly responsible for our recovery of her body. Rob never would have told us that.
Jordan Larson and Shane Miles are charged with no crimes in relation to Marilee's death. Rob Willis pleads guilty to first-degree felony murder. He is sentenced to 15 years to life.
CCTV played a massive role in this case. As soon as we knew that the dog was located on that footage, we knew that they were lying because of the CCTV. And from there, we were able to build a case and build it with more CCTV. Bringing the dog back to TTM was a crucial misstep on his part.
Every day when I see something beautiful in nature, I think about her. I think about her, wanting to get her camera out and take a picture of it and to preserve that memory. I miss talking to her, and I'm so proud to be her brother.
Mary was my forever friend. She came in and made me feel balanced and understood. I'll never be able to replace her in my life, ever. She's just one of a kind.
Next time on See No Evil.
911. There was just a shot fired. A man was just shot.
This was actually a planned out murder execution.
Do you want to tell us the truth?
Surveillance video does not lie.
It started with a door left half open. Not broken, not forced. Just slightly ajar, moving back and forth in the early evening wind, as if someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Inside the quiet house on Maple Ridge Road, a lamp glowed in the corner of the living room, casting long yellow shadows across the carpet. A backpack lay on the floor, a pair of sneakers by the couch, and on the kitchen counter, a glass of orange soda still sweating in the summer heat. The clock read 6:42 p.m. That was the last ordinary moment anyone could place inside the home of 17-year-old Emily Carter. Within hours, the town would be flooded with sirens, flashing lights, and whispers that moved faster than the police radios. A teenager had vanished. No struggle, no note, no explanation. Just a door drifting open in the wind, and a house that looked as though its owner might return at any second. But Emily Carter never did. And for more than 2 decades, her disappearance would become one of the most haunting cold cases the community had ever known. At first, nobody believed anything terrible had happened. Maple Ridge was the kind of town where people forgot to lock their cars. The kind of place where neighbors borrowed lawnmowers without asking and returned them with a 6-pack on the seat. Kids rode bikes past midnight in the summer, and the loudest crime most weeks was someone setting off illegal fireworks by the lake. Emily was exactly the kind of girl you'd expect to grow up there. Quiet but bright. A senior at Ridgeway High. Honor roll. Captain of the debate team. The type of student teachers described as reliable and focused. She planned to leave town in the fall for college, maybe Boston, maybe Chicago. Somewhere bigger. Somewhere louder. But on the evening of July 12, 1999, she was supposed to do something completely ordinary. Stay home. Her parents had driven 2 hours away to attend a family reunion. Emily had begged off, claiming she needed to study for finals. Her mother left instructions on the fridge. Order pizza, lock the doors, don't stay up too late. At 4:18 p.m., Emily answered a phone call from her best friend. At 5:03 p.m., a neighbor saw her checking the mailbox. At 6:12 p.m., a delivery driver dropped off Chinese takeout at the front porch. And sometime after that, the timeline stops breathing. When Emily's parents returned just after midnight, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The porch light was still on. The TV hummed in the living room. The takeout container sat unopened on the kitchen table. But Emily was gone. At first, they assumed the obvious. Maybe she went to a friend's house. Maybe she had taken a walk. Maybe she simply forgot to leave a note. But the phone call started. Friends said they hadn't seen her. Her car was still parked in the driveway. Her wallet and keys sat untouched on the kitchen counter. And that slowly swinging door. By 1:30 in the morning, the police were standing in the living room. Officers searched the house room by room, their flashlights moving across family photos and shelves of school trophies. Everything looked normal. Nothing appeared disturbed. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no blood. But something about the scene felt wrong. Not chaotic. Empty. As if a moment in time had been abruptly erased. The official missing persons report was filed at 2:11 a.m. By sunrise, the entire town knew. Search teams combed the woods behind Maple Ridge Road. Helicopters circled over the lake. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through tall grass and abandoned trails. Police dogs followed Emily's scent from the front porch down the street. And then, abruptly, the trail stopped, right in the middle of the road. Detectives stared at the pavement. One conclusion formed quickly. Emily hadn't wandered away. She had gotten into a vehicle. Whether willingly or not, no one could say. The first weeks of the investigation were a storm of activity. Detectives interviewed classmates, teachers, neighbors, delivery drivers. Anyone who had spoken to Emily in the final days before she vanished. And one detail surfaced again and again. A car. Several witnesses mentioned seeing a dark sedan parked near the Carter house that evening. No one could agree on the make or model. Some said black. Others insisted it was dark blue. But everyone remembered the same thing. It didn't belong there. The driver was never seen. Police canvassed the area for surveillance footage, but 1999 wasn't the era of doorbell cameras and digital archives. The few gas stations nearby had already taped over their security recordings. Whatever vehicle had been there had vanished as cleanly as Emily herself. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Posters faded on telephone poles. Search grids were expanded, then quietly abandoned. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited boxes of evidence that never seemed to lead anywhere. Emily Carter became a headline that refused to die. Local newspapers called it a mystery. Television stations called it a tragedy. But within the community, people began using another phrase. Cold case. A term that carries a particular weight in law enforcement. It doesn't mean the investigation stops. It means the answers have stopped coming. And in the Carter case, the silence stretched for decades. Every few years, a rumor surfaced. Someone claimed to have seen Emily in another state. Someone reported a suspicious man from the neighborhood. Someone insisted the police had missed something obvious. Each lead sparked a flicker of hope. Each lead collapsed into nothing. But time has a strange way of loosening secrets. And sometimes the smallest piece of forgotten evidence waits quietly for the moment someone finally notices it. 23 years after Emily Carter disappeared, a young detective named Daniel Ruiz opened a cardboard evidence box in the basement of the county police department. Inside were hundreds of items collected during the original investigation. Photographs, interview transcripts, old cassette recordings. And near the bottom of the box, sealed in a plastic evidence bag, was something almost laughably ordinary. A disposable camera. The label read, "Recovered from Carter residence, July 13th, 1999. It had never been developed. For more than 2 decades, the film sat untouched. And in that moment, Detective Ruiz realized something unsettling. No one had ever asked what might be on it. The camera was sent to a forensic lab the next morning. Technicians carefully extracted the film, uncertain whether anything would even remain after so many years. But as the images slowly appeared on the screen, one photograph made the entire room go silent. It showed the Carter driveway, taken from inside the house, and parked just beyond the mailbox was a dark sedan. The timestamp placed the photo at 6:27 p.m., less than 20 minutes before Emily Carter vanished. But the most chilling detail wasn't the car itself. It was the reflection in the driver's window, a figure sitting behind the wheel, watching the house. The photograph changed everything. For 23 years, the Carter disappearance had lived inside the vague, frustrating space of possibility. Rumors, assumptions, half-formed theories. Detectives had long believed someone might have been waiting outside that evening, but belief is not evidence, and evidence is the only language a cold case understands. Now, suddenly, there was proof that someone had been there. A car. A driver. A silent witness parked just beyond the Carter mailbox at 6:27 p.m., less than 20 minutes before Emily Carter disappeared into the void. The photograph was grainy, slightly underexposed, the kind of imperfect image disposable cameras produced at the end of the 1990s. But the shape of the vehicle was unmistakable. A dark 4-door sedan, long hood, squared rear windows, late 90s model, possibly older. The driver's window held a faint reflection, not clear enough to identify a face, but clear enough to show a human silhouette. Someone had been sitting there, watching the house. Inside the forensic lab, technicians leaned closer to the screen as the image sharpened under digital enhancement. The mailbox, the Carter driveway, the curve of Maple Ridge Road disappearing behind trees. And that car. Detective Daniel Ruiz felt a chill creep up the back of his neck. For decades, investigators had asked the same question over and over again. Who was waiting outside Emily Carter's house that night? Now the question had changed. Why was Emily taking pictures of them? Because that detail mattered. Disposable cameras weren't expensive in 1999, but teenagers didn't waste frames on random street scenes. They took pictures of friends, parties, road trips, sunsets by the lake. Yet here was Emily Carter inside her own house, lifting the camera and capturing an image of a car sitting quietly outside, which meant something had caught her attention. Something strange enough to make her document it. Technicians pulled the rest of the images from the film. Most were ordinary. Snapshots from the previous weeks. Emily and her friends at Ridgeway High graduation practice, a blurry photo of a dog in the park, a mirror selfie in her bedroom. Typical teenage fragments of a life that, at the time, still stretched forward into the future. But the final 4 photos were different. They were all taken on the evening of July 12th. The first showed the Carter living room. The second captured the front window. The third the driveway again. And the 4th photograph was the one that made the investigation explode back to life. It showed the sedan closer now, still parked near the mailbox. But the driver's door was open, and a man was standing beside it. His back faced the camera. Tall, broad shoulders, wearing a dark jacket despite the summer heat. His head tilted slightly toward the Carter house. As if listening, Detective Ruiz stared at the image for a long time. Then he quietly said the words that hadn't been spoken in this case for years. This isn't random. Within 48 hours, the photograph was circulating through every law enforcement database in the state. Vehicle analysts studied the car's shape, its trim lines, the curve of its headlights. Their conclusion narrowed the possibilities quickly. Late model 1990s Ford Taurus, one of the most common sedans on American roads at the time, which meant there had been thousands of them in the region. But investigators had something else now. Location, time, and a man who had stepped out of the car. The figure's face wasn't visible, but the body's shape offered clues. Height estimated between 5 feet 11 inches and 6 feet 2 inches. Heavy build, possibly middle-aged. The jacket was distinctive too. A dark windbreaker with white stripes down the sleeves. It looked familiar. Too familiar. Detectives pulled out boxes of evidence that hadn't been opened in years. Old interview notes, neighborhood canvassing records, handwritten statements from 1999, page after page of forgotten testimony. Somewhere inside those documents was a name. Someone had seen something that night. Someone always does. And slowly, buried under 23 years of dust, one witness statement began to stand out. It came from a man named Harold Benton, age 64 at the time. He lived 2 houses down from the Carter family. Benton had spoken with police the morning after Emily disappeared, offering what investigators initially considered a vague observation. He told them he had seen a large man in a dark jacket walking near the Carter driveway that evening. At the time, detectives had dismissed it. Too general, too uncertain. But now the description matched the figure in the photograph almost perfectly. Detective Ruiz leaned back in his chair. The hair on his arms rose again, because Benton's statement contained another detail investigators had overlooked. He claimed the man had knocked on the Carter front door. Not aggressively. Just once. A slow, deliberate knock. The witness said he remembered it clearly because he was watering his lawn at the time and the sound echoed across the quiet street. Knock. Pause. Knock. And then the man stepped back toward the car. Waiting. That detail changed the entire narrative. For 23 years, police had believed Emily might have been abducted suddenly, grabbed while stepping outside, forced into a vehicle before she could react. But if someone knocked on the door, That meant Emily opened it, which meant she might have known the person standing there. The possibility was chilling, because the Carter investigation had always focused heavily on strangers, suspicious travelers, passing criminals, outsiders. But what if the man outside that door wasn't a stranger at all? What if Emily had recognized him? What if she had spoken to him? The case files revealed something else too. In 1999, detectives had asked Emily's friends a very specific question. Was she afraid of anyone? Did anyone bother her? Did she mention someone following her? The answers had all been the same.
No.
Emily Carter didn't have enemies. But teenagers often hide things. Private arguments, secret relationships, people they don't want their parents to know about. And sometimes those secrets are the last things they take with them. Detective Ruiz decided to revisit one of the oldest pieces of evidence in the entire case: Emily's phone records. In 1999, landline calls were easier to trace, but harder to interpret. The Carter house had received dozens of calls in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Most were normal.
Friends.
School contacts. Relatives. But one number appeared repeatedly. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes just a few seconds long. And the number didn't belong to any of Emily's known friends. Back then, investigators had attempted to trace it. The line had been registered to a prepaid cellular account, purchased with cash, disconnected just days after Emily vanished. At the time, that trail had gone cold immediately. But technology in 2022 was very different from technology in 1999. Detectives forwarded the number to a digital forensic unit. Within a week, analysts managed to recover partial records tied to the prepaid account. Location pings from old cell towers. Fragments of connection data preserved deep within archival telecom systems. The results were unsettling. The phone had been active in Maple Ridge repeatedly during the weeks before Emily disappeared. And on the night of July 12th, it connected to a tower less than half a mile from the Carter house. At 6:31 p.m., for minutes after the photograph of the sedan had been taken, which meant one thing. The person in that car might have been the same person calling Emily, waiting outside, watching the house, and possibly the same person who knocked on her door just minutes before she vanished forever. The evidence was beginning to breathe again. And for the first time in 23 years, the Carter cold case no longer looked frozen. It looked like someone had been planning something.
Carefully.
Quietly. For weeks. The discovery of the photographs did something the Carter investigation hadn't experienced in more than 2 decades. It created movement. For years the case had existed in silence, sealed inside evidence boxes and fading newspaper clippings. But now detectives were reopening files, re-interviewing witnesses, retracing the timeline minute by minute. The quiet Maple Ridge Police Department suddenly felt the way it must have felt back in the summer of 1999, tense, restless, filled with a sense that something important was hiding just out of sight. The photograph of the sedan became the center of everything. Analysts enlarged it frame by frame, studying reflections in the windows, shadows along the pavement, the slight angle of the vehicle parked beside the Carter mailbox. Under heavy digital processing, one small detail slowly sharpened into view. The license plate. Not fully visible. But 3 characters emerged from the blur.
Setting bear.
Just 3 symbols from a 6-digit plate. But sometimes a fragment is enough to crack open a door that has been locked for years. Detectives began combing through registration records from the late 1990s. It was tedious work, the kind that takes days and produces nothing but dead ends. Thousands of Ford Tauruses had been registered across the state during that time. Thousands of license plates could potentially contain those 3 characters. But investigators narrowed the list quickly. Vehicles matching the make and color. Registered within 50 miles of Maple Ridge. Active during the summer of 1999. The massive list shrank to fewer than 200 possibilities. 200 cars. 200 owners. 200 people who might have been sitting in that sedan outside Emily Carter's house. The list went to the cold case unit. Each name was checked against criminal records, employment history, and geographic ties to Maple Ridge. Some had already moved away decades earlier. Some were elderly residents who had never left town. Some had died. But one name caused the room to grow quiet when it appeared on the screen.
Richard Hale.
Age 36 in 1999. Residence listed less than 3 miles from the Carter house. Vehicle registered, dark blue 1997 Ford Taurus. Partial plate match, 7KB. The remaining characters were hidden in the blur of the photograph, but the alignment was close enough to raise eyebrows. Detective Ruiz studied the file carefully. Hale had no major criminal record. A few minor citations, nothing violent. He worked as a maintenance technician at an electronics warehouse outside town. Quiet, according to old records. Kept to himself. But the most unsettling detail came from a line buried in an old employment report. Before working at the warehouse, Hale had held a temporary job at Ridgeway High School, the same school Emily Carter attended. The job had lasted less than 6 months. He worked maintenance during the winter of 1998. That meant he had access to the building. Hallways, classrooms, lockers, students. Detectives exchanged glances. If Hale had encountered Emily there, the entire narrative changed again. This wouldn't be a random encounter. It would mean the person who knocked on her door that evening might have known exactly who she was. The cold case unit decided to pull the original witness interviews from Ridgeway High. Teachers, students, staff. The transcripts were old, typed on yellowing paper, filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Most of the statements were routine, people confirming when they last saw Emily, what kind of student she was, whether anything seemed unusual. But halfway through one folder, Detective Ruiz found a line that made his pulse quicken. A student named Melissa Grant had mentioned a maintenance guy who sometimes watched students in the hallway. The comment was brief, almost casual. She told investigators the man made her uncomfortable. When detectives asked if she remembered his name, the transcript recorded her answer in a single uncertain sentence. I think it was something like Hale. The room fell silent again. For 23 years, that detail had sat buried inside the interview files, unnoticed, unconnected to anything else. Now it sat beside a photograph of a dark sedan and a man standing outside Emily Carter's house. Investigators quickly located Richard Hale's current address. He still lived in the region. Not Maple Ridge exactly, but a smaller rural community about 30 miles away. The kind of quiet place where gravel roads disappear into farmland and neighbors wave from pickup trucks passing in the opposite direction. Hale was 59 now. Still working maintenance. Still driving a sedan, though not the same one from 1999. When detectives ran his name through national databases, something else surfaced. In 2007, Hale had been questioned in connection with a missing pets investigation in a neighboring county. The case had gone nowhere. But the incident revealed a pattern investigators couldn't ignore. Strange behavior. Quiet complaints. Nothing that had ever crossed the threshold into a criminal charge. But enough to create unease. Detective Ruiz sat in the dim conference room reviewing the timeline again. July 12, 1999. 6:12 p.m., Chinese takeout delivered. 6:27 p.m., Emily takes photo of car outside. 6:31 p.m., prepaid phone connects to nearby cell tower. Sometime shortly after that, a knock on the door. Emily opens it, and then she disappears. If Richard Hale had been sitting in that car, it meant he had been waiting, watching the house, possibly calling the phone. But the biggest question remained unanswered. What happened after the door opened? Because there were no signs of struggle. No screams reported by neighbors. No blood. No broken objects. Which suggested something investigators often find deeply disturbing in cases like this.
Control.
If Hale was responsible, he had managed to convince Emily to step outside voluntarily.
Perhaps to talk. Perhaps to look at something.
Perhaps under a false story. The kind that sounds harmless in the moment. Can you come help me for a second? Your dad asked me to stop by. I need directions. Small lies that open doors. The cold case unit began preparing a quiet surveillance operation. They wanted to observe Hale before making any direct contact. Watch his habits. Understand his daily routine. But the investigation moved faster than expected. Because when detectives visited the county records office to examine Hale's old vehicle registration, the clerk handed them a thin folder that had been archived for years. Inside were the documents related to the 1997 Ford Taurus. Ownership history, insurance information, inspection records, and one final form dated August 3, 1999. 3 weeks after Emily Carter vanished, the vehicle had been reported stolen. Detective Ruiz read the report carefully. According to Hale, the car had disappeared overnight from the parking lot of his apartment complex. Police at the time had taken the report but never located the vehicle. It was listed as unrecovered, which meant the car seen in Emily's photograph had vanished just weeks after her disappearance.
Gone. Erased.
The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. Investigators now had a suspect whose vehicle matched the car in the photograph, who had once worked at Emily's school, who lived nearby, and whose car conveniently disappeared shortly after the night she vanished. But suspicion alone doesn't close a cold case. They needed something stronger. Something physical. Something that connected Richard Hale directly to the Carter house. Detectives returned to the original evidence collected in 1999. Door handles, mailbox surfaces, the porch railing. Most of the samples had been tested long ago using outdated forensic techniques that often produced incomplete results. But modern DNA analysis had advanced dramatically. Even the faintest biological traces could now be recovered from surfaces once thought useless. Technicians reopened sealed evidence bags, carefully swabbing areas that investigators decades earlier had considered irrelevant. And 3 days later, the lab called. They had found something. A partial DNA profile, recovered from the Carter mailbox. Exactly where the dark sedan had been parked. Exactly where the man in the photograph had been standing. The sample was incomplete, degraded by time and weather. But it was enough to run through the National DNA database. Detective Ruiz waited quietly in the lab as the computer processed the sequence. Minutes passed. Then the screen displayed a notification. The profile didn't match any convicted offender. But it did match a voluntary DNA sample collected years earlier during a workplace medical screening. Name attached to the record.
Richard Hale.
For the first time in 23 years, the Carter investigation had something investigators had never possessed before. A suspect tied to the scene. A suspect tied to the timeline. And a suspect who had been sitting outside Emily Carter's house minutes before she vanished into one of the most haunting cold cases the town had ever known. But the deeper detectives looked into Richard Hale's life, the more unsettling the picture became. Because the quiet maintenance worker had been keeping something hidden for a very long time. For more than 2 decades, Richard Hale had lived a life so ordinary it barely left a shadow.
He woke up early.
Left for work before sunrise. Fixed machinery, repaired wiring, replaced broken panels in warehouses and storage facilities across the county. He returned home at night to a small house at the end of a gravel road, where the lights inside rarely stayed on past 10. No parties. No visitors.
No disturbances.
Neighbors described him with the same words over and over again. Quiet.
Polite.
Invisible. But investigators studying the Carter cold case now understood something chilling about invisibility. Sometimes it's not accidental. Sometimes it's practiced. Detective Daniel Ruiz drove past Hale's property for the first time just after sunrise on a gray October morning. The road leading there cut through a stretch of farmland dotted with rusted mailboxes and long wooden fences. Hale's house sat back from the road, partially hidden behind a line of old pine trees. A small single-story structure. White siding faded by years of sun and rain. 2 vehicles in the driveway. A newer silver sedan and a pickup truck. No movement. The place looked exactly like the home of a man who wanted to disappear into routine. Ruiz parked half a mile away and studied the property through binoculars. What he saw was not dramatic. But sometimes what isn't dramatic is exactly what investigators notice most. At 7:04 a.m., Hale stepped out the front door. He moved slowly, but with a steady rhythm that suggested someone deeply accustomed to routine. He locked the door, walked to the sedan, and placed a black tool bag on the passenger seat. The windbreaker he wore stopped Ruiz cold. Dark fabric. White stripes down the sleeves. Almost identical to the jacket in the photograph taken by Emily Carter 23 years earlier. For a moment, Ruiz felt that strange sensation investigators sometimes experience in long-dormant cases, the eerie feeling that the past is standing right in front of them, unchanged. Hale drove away without noticing the surveillance vehicle parked down the road. Over the next week, detectives followed him carefully. Work, home, grocery store, gas station. The pattern never changed. But during that surveillance, investigators uncovered something unexpected. Hale wasn't just quiet. He was isolated. Phone records showed almost no outgoing calls. No social media presence. No regular visitors. Even his workplace interactions were minimal, according to coworkers interviewed by detectives. One employee described Hale as the kind of guy who could stand in the room for an hour and nobody would remember he was there. But when detectives searched through historical employment records, they discovered something that sent a ripple of unease through the investigation team. Ridgeway High School had hired Hale twice. The first time was known, the winter maintenance job in 1998. But the second time appeared in a much shorter contract. July 1999, 2 weeks before Emily Carter disappeared. The job description was simple. Exterior electrical repair. Duration, 5 days. Location, the football field lighting system and parking lot fixtures. Which meant Hale had been working at the school again just days before Emily vanished. Walking the same hallways. Standing in the same parking lot where students gathered after class. And possibly seeing Emily Carter again. The realization forced detectives to revisit something they had long assumed. Emily had planned to leave Maple Ridge that fall. College acceptance letters had already started arriving. Her future was unfolding quickly, pulling her away from the quiet town she had grown up in. But what if someone had noticed that? What if someone had been watching her? Investigators pulled the final weeks of Emily's personal records. Her planner, her school notebooks, even old yearbook signing pages that friends had filled with messages. Most of the notes were ordinary teenage fare. Stay in touch. Don't forget us when you're famous. But one page inside her planner contained a line that investigators had never noticed before. It was written in pencil. Small. Quick. Almost careless. Guy from maintenance keeps asking weird questions. The note had no date attached. No name. Just that single sentence buried between reminders about homework and a dentist appointment. But it changed the tone of the investigation instantly. If Hale had been interacting with Emily before she vanished, it meant the encounter on July 12th might not have been the first time he approached her. Which raised another terrifying possibility. The calls to the prepaid phone. Detectives now believe those calls might have been part of a longer pattern. Contact. Pressure. Persistence. The kind that sometimes escalates slowly until the moment everything collapses. To confirm that theory, investigators needed one thing. A conversation with Richard Hale. But they approached the situation carefully. Cold case interrogations are delicate. A suspect who has lived quietly for 23 years might react unpredictably when the past suddenly returns. So detectives waited until they had something stronger. And the break came from an unexpected place. Inside a dusty vehicle impound lot outside the county. Because while Richard Hale's Ford Taurus had been reported stolen in August of 1999, investigators began wondering if the car had truly vanished. Vehicles from that era were often abandoned, impounded, and forgotten inside storage facilities when owners failed to reclaim them. So detectives began searching statewide records, salvage yards, insurance auctions, tow company databases. The process took weeks. Thousands of vehicles had passed through those systems over 2 decades. But eventually, a match appeared. A dark blue 1997 Ford Taurus had been recovered in October of 1999.
Not stolen.
Abandoned. It was discovered on a dirt road nearly 70 miles outside Maple Ridge, partially hidden behind a row of trees. The vehicle had been towed and stored temporarily before being transferred to a scrap auction. But the auction paperwork showed something strange. No buyer ever claimed it. which meant the car had never been dismantled. Instead, it had sat untouched inside a long-term storage facility for 23 years. Detectives drove to the warehouse the next morning. Rows of old vehicles filled the enormous building, many covered in dust so thick the original paint colors were barely visible. And near the back of the structure, beneath a faded tarp, sat the Ford Taurus. The same body shape, the same faded dark blue paint, the same license plate, 7KB, and the remaining numbers now fully visible. It matched Richard Hale's registration exactly. The moment investigators opened the driver's door, the smell of old upholstery and rusted metal spilled into the air. The interior looked frozen in time. A cracked dashboard, an old cassette tape inside the stereo, and something else. Something investigators rarely find after so many years. A stain, dark brown, spread across the rear seat cushion. Detective Ruiz felt the atmosphere inside the warehouse shift instantly. Because even after 23 years, some evidence refuses to disappear. Forensic technicians carefully cut the section of fabric from the seat and sealed it inside an evidence bag. Preliminary tests were done on site. The chemical reaction was immediate.
Blood.
A large amount of it, which meant the abandoned Ford Taurus might not just have been connected to Emily Carter's disappearance. It might have been the place where her final moments unfolded. And if that was true, the quiet man living 30 miles away had been hiding something far darker than anyone in Maple Ridge had imagined. Because vehicles don't bleed. People do. The discovery inside the Ford Taurus turned the quiet investigation into something far more urgent. For 23 years, the Carter disappearance had existed in a strange space between tragedy and mystery. A girl vanished. No body. No confirmed crime scene. Just absence. But the bloodstain in the rear seat of Richard Hale's abandoned car changed the entire narrative. Now the case had something investigators rarely find after decades of silence. Violence. The vehicle was sealed immediately and transported under heavy forensic protocol to the State Crime Laboratory. Every inch of the interior was documented before technicians began removing evidence piece by piece. Dust, fibers, hair fragments, even microscopic particles trapped in the worn fabric of the seats. The process was slow and meticulous. Cold cases demand patience because time destroys evidence in ways no criminal ever could. Sunlight fades materials. Temperature changes break down biological traces. Moisture corrodes surfaces. But sometimes time also preserves secrets. And this car had been sitting in darkness for more than 2 decades. The rear seat stain was the first thing tested. Technicians extracted a sample and ran a rapid DNA analysis. The lab technicians didn't speak much while the machine processed the degraded genetic material. They had seen too many cold cases produce nothing but broken sequences and inconclusive results. But this time, something emerged. A partial DNA profile. Degraded, fragmented, but still recognizable. The comparison process took several hours. When the result appeared on the screen, the room went silent. The DNA matched Emily Carter. The blood inside Richard Hale's car belonged to the girl who had disappeared from Maple Ridge 23 years earlier. The confirmation hit investigators like a shockwave. For the first time since July 12, 1999, the Carter case was no longer classified as a missing person investigation. It was now officially a homicide. Detective Daniel Ruiz stood in the lab staring at the results, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily across the room. The silence carried a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because the mystery had finally begun to reveal itself. Dread because the truth unfolding in front of them was darker than anyone had hoped. Emily Carter had not simply vanished. She had been in that car. And she had bled there. But the most unsettling question remained. Where was she now? Because if the crime occurred inside the Taurus, Hale must have moved the body somewhere afterward. The car had been abandoned 70 miles away from Maple Ridge, on a dirt road that wound through remote farmland and wooded areas. Investigators returned to the recovery site the very next day. The road itself was barely more than a narrow strip of gravel cutting between acres of tall grass and neglected forest. In 1999, it had been even more isolated, a forgotten agricultural route used mostly by farmers. The spot where the Taurus had been discovered was difficult to notice unless someone knew exactly where to look, which suggested something disturbing. The person who abandoned the car had chosen the location carefully. Search teams began combing the surrounding land. Cadaver dogs moved slowly through the brush, their handlers watching every change in posture, every pause in their movement. Hours passed. Then one of the dogs stopped abruptly near a cluster of oak trees about 50 yards from the road. The animal stiffened, its nose pressed into the ground. Then it began digging. The entire search team froze. The soil there looked slightly different, darker, disturbed long ago, and then hardened by years of weather and vegetation growth. Detectives ordered a careful excavation. Every shovel movement was slow and deliberate. Archaeological techniques replaced the usual urgency of a crime scene search. The deeper they dug, the heavier the air seemed to become. And then the shovel struck something. Not stone.
Bone.
The dig stopped immediately. Forensic anthropologists took over the excavation, brushing away layers of dirt with delicate tools. Slowly, the outline of a human skeleton began to emerge from the earth. The body had been buried shallowly, wrapped in what appeared to be a deteriorated tarp. The remains were badly decomposed, but the skeletal structure suggested a young female. And near the ribcage, partially preserved by the tarp, investigators discovered a small silver necklace. The pendant was shaped like a star. Detective Ruiz recognized it instantly. The necklace had been mentioned in Emily Carter's missing person report. Her mother had described it to police the morning after the disappearance, a gift given to Emily on her 16th birthday. The moment the pendant was lifted from the soil, there was no longer any doubt. After 23 years, Emily Carter had finally been found. The confirmation reached Maple Ridge that same evening. The reaction across the community was immediate and emotional. For decades, the town had lived with the uncomfortable uncertainty of the case. Some believed Emily had run away. Others believed she had been abducted by a stranger passing through town. But now the truth had a shape. Emily Carter had been murdered and buried in a remote field 70 miles from her home. The focus of the investigation now narrowed to one person.
Richard Hale.
Detectives knew they couldn't wait any longer. The evidence connecting him to the crime had become overwhelming. The car, the DNA, the witness statement, the photograph, the phone records. But what investigators still needed was the final piece. A confession. Or at least a reaction. Something that might reveal what happened inside that car on the night Emily Carter disappeared. 2 detectives drove to Hale's house just after sunset the following day. The sky was turning dark as they pulled into the gravel driveway. The porch light was already on, casting a pale circle across the wooden steps leading to the front door. Hale's sedan sat parked beside the house, which meant he was home. Detective Ruiz approached the door slowly and knocked.
Once.
Then again. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Richard Hale stood there in the same dark windbreaker investigators had seen during surveillance. He looked older than his photographs, his face lined with the quiet exhaustion of years spent alone. But his eyes were sharp, observant,
calculating.
For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ruiz introduced himself calmly. Mr. Hale, we'd like to ask you a few questions about a vehicle you owned back in 1999. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the wind to rustle the pine trees behind the house. Hale's expression didn't change, but something subtle flickered across his eyes. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. As if he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. And in that instant, Detective Ruiz realized something deeply unsettling. The quiet man standing in front of them had been living with this secret for 23 years. And now the past had finally arrived at his front door. Richard Hale didn't slam the door. He didn't panic. He didn't even appear surprised. For a moment, he simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, his face illuminated by the dim yellow porch light. The wind rustled through the pine trees behind the house, and somewhere far down the gravel road a truck passed, its engine fading into the distance. The silence stretched long enough to feel unnatural. Then Hale stepped aside.
"Come in," he said. His voice was calm.
Almost tired. Detective Daniel Ruiz exchanged a brief glance with his partner before stepping into the house. The interior looked exactly how investigators imagined it would: sparse, quiet, carefully ordered. A small couch facing an old television. A kitchen table with a single chair. Shelves holding tools, manuals, and stacks of neatly arranged hardware supplies. Nothing personal. No family photographs. No decorations.
Just a life stripped down to routine.
Hale gestured toward the table. "You said this was about a car?" Ruiz didn't sit right away. Instead, he studied the man standing across from him, looking for the small signals investigators learned to recognize after years of interrogations.
Sweat.
Shaking hands. Avoided eye contact. But Hale displayed none of them. If anything, he looked almost prepared. Ruiz finally sat down and opened a thin folder on the table. Inside were copies of the photographs recovered from Emily Carter's disposable camera. He slid the first image across the surface. The picture of the sedan parked beside the Carter mailbox. Hale glanced at it briefly. No reaction. Just a small nod, as if acknowledging a familiar object. "That's a Ford Taurus," he said. "Yes," Ruiz replied quietly. "It is." The detective slid another photograph forward. This one showed the man standing outside the car, his back turned toward the camera. Hale studied the image longer.
Still no panic.
Still no visible emotion. Then Ruiz placed the final document on the table. A printout of the DNA analysis taken from the rear seat of Hale's abandoned vehicle. The room grew very quiet. Outside, the wind continued moving through the trees. For the first time, Hale leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly. "You found the car," he said. The sentence wasn't a question. Ruiz nodded once. "Yes." Another pause. Hale rubbed his hands together slowly, as if warming them against an invisible cold. "Been a long time," he murmured. Detective Ruiz leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "Emily Carter's blood was inside that car." The words hung in the air. Hale stared at the table. Seconds passed. Then a minute. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Not frightened. Not defensive. Just distant. Like someone describing a memory they had replayed too many times. "I didn't plan it," he said. The detectives remained silent. Hale continued. "She opened the door." His eyes moved toward the photographs again.
"She knew who I was."
From the school. Ruiz felt the tension in the room tighten. Hale spoke slowly, choosing his words with careful precision. "I told her I needed help. Something with the lights near the field. I said the maintenance office couldn't reach her father, and thought she might know where he was." The explanation sounded thin. But sometimes lies survive for years because they sound just believable enough in the moment. She stepped outside. Hale continued quietly. "Just for a minute." Ruiz waited. "What happened next?" he asked. Hale didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the wood grain on the table. "When people say something terrible happens fast, they're wrong," he said. "It doesn't feel fast." The silence thickened. "It feels slow." Ruiz's partner shifted slightly in his chair. Hale's voice dropped almost to a whisper. She started asking questions. Why I was there. Why I needed help so late. He paused. I think she realized something was wrong. The detective felt the cold weight of the moment settle deeper into the room. Hale's eyes moved toward the window. I grabbed her arm. Another pause. She screamed. The word hung in the air like a fracture in the room. Hale continued speaking in the same detached tone. I didn't expect that. Ruiz felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. What did you do then? He asked. Hale swallowed slowly. I told her to get in the car. Did she?
No.
Another long silence. Then Hale spoke the next words without looking up. She tried to run. The detectives already knew what must have happened next. But hearing it from him made the room feel smaller. I panicked, Hale said. I grabbed her again. He paused, then added something that made Ruiz's stomach tighten. She hit her head on the door frame. For the first time, Hale's voice cracked slightly. After that, there was blood. Ruiz slid the DNA report closer across the table. "The back seat," he said quietly. Hale nodded once. "She was still breathing when I drove away." The detectives exchanged another brief glance. That detail was important. It meant Emily Carter might have been alive when Hale left Maple Ridge. "How far did you drive?" Ruiz asked. Hale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the photograph of the sedan for a long time. Then, he finally said something that made the entire investigation shift again. "I didn't kill her in the car." The words landed like a stone. Ruiz felt a chill move across his arms. "Then where?" he asked carefully. Hale leaned back in his chair again. For the first time since the interrogation began, he looked directly at the detective. And there was something strange in his expression now. Not guilt. Not fear. Something closer to resignation. "Out there," he said quietly. He lifted a hand and pointed toward the dark woods beyond the window. But what Hale said next changed everything investigators thought they knew about the case. "Only that's not where she died." The detectives froze. Ruiz's voice lowered. "What do you mean?" Hale rubbed his face slowly, as if exhausted by a memory that refused to fade. "She woke up again," he said. The room went silent. "After I buried her." The words hung in the air like something unreal. Ruiz stared at him. "You're saying she was alive?"
Hale nodded slowly.
"I heard her." A long pause. A sound under the dirt. The detective felt his pulse begin to hammer in his ears. "What did you do?" Ruiz asked. For the first time, Hale's composure fractured. He closed his eyes. "I left." The room fell completely silent. Detective Ruiz stared at the man across the table, trying to process what he had just heard. Because if Hale was telling the truth, it meant something far more horrifying than anyone had imagined had happened in that field 23 years earlier. Emily Carter hadn't died inside that car. And she hadn't died during the struggle outside her home. She had been buried alive. The words settled over the room like a suffocating fog. For several seconds, no one spoke. The faint hum of the refrigerator in Richard Hale's kitchen filled the silence, a dull mechanical sound that suddenly felt too loud, too ordinary for the weight of what had just been said. Detective Daniel Ruiz stared across the table, his mind replaying Hale's last sentence again and again. "She woke up again after I buried her." In 20 years of law enforcement, Ruiz had heard confessions that twisted the stomach, stories that left entire interrogation rooms silent. But something about this one was different. It wasn't just violence. It was time. 23 years of time separating the crime from this quiet moment in a dim kitchen. And somewhere inside that span of years, a girl had clawed at the darkness beneath the earth. Ruiz forced his voice to remain steady. "You're telling us Emily Carter was still alive when you buried her?" Hale's hands were folded loosely on the table. He didn't look up. "I thought she was dead." The detective felt anger surge again. But she wasn't. Hale shook his head slowly.
"No."
The room felt colder. Ruiz leaned forward. "What did you hear?" Hale exhaled through his nose, his eyes drifting toward the window again. Movement. The single word felt heavy. I had already covered the tarp with dirt. I was standing there trying to think about what to do with the car. He paused. And then the ground shifted. Ruiz felt a knot tighten in his chest. "What kind of movement?"
Hale hesitated.
"Like someone turning over." The silence stretched. And then a sound, Hale said quietly. "What sound?"
Hale swallowed.
"A voice." The detectives exchanged a glance. "What did she say?" Ruiz asked. Hale rubbed his temples slowly. "I couldn't understand the words." His voice dropped. It sounded like she was trying to breathe. The description made the air in the room feel unbearable. Ruiz imagined the scene unfolding in that remote field, darkness settling over the trees, the quiet rustle of wind through grass, and beneath the earth a girl waking up in terror. "What did you do then?" Ruiz asked. Hale's eyes closed again. "Nothing." The detective's jaw tightened. You heard her alive and you did nothing? Hale opened his eyes. I stood there for a while. How long? I don't know. His voice sounded distant again. Maybe a minute. Maybe longer. The detectives waited. Finally, Ruiz asked the question that hung over everything. Why didn't you dig her out? Hale stared at the table. Because if she got out, she would tell everyone. The room fell silent again. The simplicity of the answer was almost unbearable. Not rage. Not panic. Just calculation. Ruiz felt his hands tighten against the edge of the table. So you left. Hale nodded. I drove away. Outside the house, the wind had picked up, rattling branches against the side of the building. For a moment, the sound almost resembled scratching. Ruiz pushed the thought away. When the car was found, the detective said slowly, it was abandoned 70 miles from that field. Why? Hale shrugged slightly. I couldn't keep it. Because of the blood? Yes. Ruiz studied him carefully. You reported it stolen. That's right. The detective flipped through the folder in front of him. And then you went back to work. Back to your life. Hale gave a small, empty nod. Yes. The normality of that statement made Ruiz feel something dark settle deep in his chest. A girl vanished. A town searched for years. And the man responsible simply returned to his routine. But the detective knew something about confessions. They rarely end where the suspect thinks they do. There are always details buried beneath the first story. Pieces the mind tries to hide. Richard, Ruiz said quietly. For the first time, he used the man's first name. When you left that field, you said you heard her voice. Hale nodded. Yes. But you never checked again.
No.
Ruiz leaned closer. You never went back.
Hale hesitated.
The pause lasted only a few seconds, but Ruiz noticed it. You did go back, the detective said. Hale's eyes moved slightly. A flicker of tension.
Ruiz knew he was right.
When? Ruiz asked. Hale's shoulders shifted as if carrying a weight he had kept hidden for years. 2 days later. The detectives exchanged another look. Why? Ruiz asked. Hale rubbed his hands together again. I couldn't sleep. His voice sounded strained now. I kept hearing it in my head. What? The sound under the dirt. The room grew quiet again. So you drove back to the field, Ruiz said. Hale nodded. Yes. And? Hale looked down. There was a hole. The words came out slowly. Ruiz felt a chill creep along his spine. A hole, he repeated. In the ground, Hale said. Near the trees. The detective's heart began beating faster. How big? Hale held his hands apart slightly. Like someone had dug upward. The room seemed to tilt. Ruiz stared at him. You're saying the grave had been disturbed? Yes. What about the body?
Hale swallowed.
It wasn't there. The silence that followed felt enormous. Ruiz leaned forward sharply. You didn't find her?
No.
The detective's voice hardened. But we did. He slid a photograph across the table, the image of the skeleton uncovered during the excavation. The remains were still buried at that site. Hale stared at the picture for a long time. Then he shook his head slowly. That's not how I left it. Ruiz's pulse hammered in his ears. What do you mean? Hale looked up for the first time since the interrogation began.
His eyes were wide now, confused.
Almost frightened. When I came back, he said quietly, the grave was empty. The detectives felt the entire case shift under their feet. Because forensic teams had already confirmed the skeleton recovered in the field belonged to Emily Carter. Which meant only one thing could explain Hale's story. Either he was lying, or something impossible had happened in that field 23 years ago.
Ruiz spoke carefully.
You're telling us someone else moved the body?
Hale nodded slowly.
Yes. Who? I don't know. The detective studied him carefully. Did you see anyone?
No.
Any cars? Any lights? Hale shook his head. Nothing. The quiet maintenance worker who had just confessed to burying a teenage girl alive now looked genuinely unsettled. And that detail made Ruiz's instincts twist. because hardened criminals sometimes fake fear. But the reaction Hale was showing now looked different. It looked like the kind of fear that comes from something unexpected, something even he hadn't planned. Ruiz leaned back in his chair. The room felt smaller now. He glanced again at the photograph of the skeleton recovered from the grave. The forensic report had been clear. The bones had been in that soil for decades, which meant Hale's story about the empty grave could not be true. Unless he had returned to the wrong place. Ruiz slowly slid a map across the table. It showed the exact coordinates of the excavation site. Is this where you buried her? Hale studied the map carefully. His finger hovered over the location. Then he slowly shook his head.
No.
The detective's stomach dropped. That's not the spot, Hale said. He moved his finger several inches to the left. Here. The new location was nearly half a mile deeper into the woods. And in that moment, Detective Ruiz realized something that made the entire investigation suddenly feel unfinished. They had found a body, but according to the man who buried Emily Carter, they had been digging in the wrong place. The room fell silent again. Detective Daniel Ruiz stared down at the map on the table, his eyes locked on the spot where Richard Hale's finger now rested. It was a small shift on paper, barely half a mile deeper into the woods, but in an investigation that had stretched across 23 years, even a few hundred yards could mean the difference between truth and misunderstanding. You're sure about that? Ruiz asked quietly. Hale didn't hesitate. Yes. Ruiz tapped the map lightly. The body we recovered was buried here, he said, pointing to the original excavation site where cadaver dogs had alerted and forensic teams had uncovered the skeletal remains with the star-shaped necklace. Hale shook his head slowly. That's not where I left her. The words hung in the air. Ruiz studied the man carefully, searching for any hint of deception. People who fabricate stories usually struggle with details, distances, directions, timelines. Their eyes move too much. Their answers become vague. But Hale's gaze remained steady. I remember the trees, Hale continued quietly. 3 oaks close together. The ground slopes down toward a small ditch. Ruiz glanced again at the map. The location Hale indicated matched that description almost perfectly, which meant the first grave site investigators excavated might not have been the original burial location at all. The realization sent a ripple of unease through the detectives, because that raised a question none of them had considered before. If the body they found wasn't where Hale buried Emily Carter, then how did it end up there?
Ruiz stood slowly.
He folded the map and placed it back inside the folder. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hale, he said calmly. Hale blinked once, surprised by the sudden shift. That's it. For now. Ruiz's partner rose from his chair. We'll be in touch. The detectives walked toward the front door, the quiet interior of Hale's house closing in behind them. As Ruiz stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air hit his face, clearing the tension that had built during the interrogation. Behind him, Hale remained standing in the doorway, watching. Not angry, not defensive, just waiting, as if he had already accepted whatever would happen next. Ruiz climbed into the unmarked vehicle and closed the door. For several seconds, he didn't start the engine. His partner finally spoke. You believe him? Ruiz stared out at the dark tree line beyond the gravel road. I believe he buried her, he said. But the rest? The detective exhaled slowly. I'm not sure. The car pulled away from the house, headlights cutting through the rural darkness. Back at the command center, the interrogation transcript spread quickly through the investigation team. Officers gathered around tables covered with maps, photographs, and forensic reports, trying to reconcile Hale's confession with the physical evidence already recovered. On one side of the board hung the image of the skeleton found during the excavation, the star-shaped necklace, the tarp remnants, all the pieces that confirmed Emily Carter had indeed been buried in that field. But now another question hovered above everything. Had she been moved? Forensic anthropologists began reviewing the bone analysis again. Skeletal remains can reveal subtle clues about what happened after burial: soil composition, root growth, insect activity. Each environment leaves a kind of fingerprint on bones over time. And that's when the second anomaly appeared. The soil found between the bones did not perfectly match the soil from the excavation site. It was close, but not identical. There were small differences in mineral composition, different traces of plant material, which meant the skeleton had likely been buried somewhere else first before ending up in the grave investigators had uncovered. The room filled with murmurs as the forensic report circulated. Detective Ruiz leaned against the table, arms crossed, absorbing the implications. Hale might not have been lying. Emily Carter may have been buried in one place and later moved to another. But by who? The possibility opened a new branch in the investigation, one that hadn't existed for 23 years. Because if Hale had returned to find the grave empty, someone else had discovered the burial site before investigators ever arrived. Someone who knew the body was there. Someone who chose to move it. But why move a body and bury it again only a short distance away? The answer might lie in the timeline. Ruiz returned to the map Hale had pointed to earlier. The second location sat deeper inside the woods, nearly hidden from the dirt road. If Emily had originally been buried there, it would have been almost impossible for anyone to discover her by accident, which suggested something deliberate. Someone had gone into those woods looking for something. The next morning, search teams returned to the field. The sun had barely risen when investigators began walking the terrain again, this time focusing on the coordinates Hale had indicated. The area looked much like the rest of the land. Tall grass, scattered trees, patches of uneven ground hardened by years of weather. But about 40 minutes into the search, one of the officers called out, "Over here." Ruiz walked quickly toward the voice. The ground beneath the oak trees showed signs of disturbance. Not fresh, but old. The soil color was slightly darker in a rough oval shape, a patch where grass grew differently from the surrounding area. It looked exactly like what investigators expect to find when earth has been dug up long ago and later settled again. Ruiz knelt beside the patch. The ground felt firm, compacted by years of rain and heat. But the shape was unmistakable. This had been a grave. The original grave. Excavation began within the hour. Forensic teams worked carefully, peeling back layers of soil that had hardened over 2 decades. Every scoop of dirt was sifted, every fragment documented. And within the first foot of soil, they began finding something unexpected. Fragments of fabric. Dark blue threads. Ruiz recognized the color immediately. It matched the tarp material recovered from the skeleton found at the second burial site, which meant Hale had been telling the truth about at least one thing. Emily Carter had originally been buried here. But deeper into the excavation, investigators found something else. Something that made the entire team stop working. Inside the soil were scratch marks. Long, narrow grooves carved into the dirt walls of the grave. Ruiz stared at them in silence. The marks ran upward, toward the surface. Forensic anthropologists leaned closer, measuring the spacing between the grooves. Finger width. Human finger width. Someone had clawed at the dirt. Hard. Desperate. Trying to reach the air above. The scratches continued nearly 2 feet up the side of the grave before fading away. Ruiz felt the weight of the discovery settle heavily around him. Hale's story had sounded unbelievable. But now the earth itself seemed to be confirming it. Emily Carter had been alive inside that grave. Alive long enough to fight. Alive long enough to claw her way upward through the soil. The detectives stood quietly around the excavation site. Wind rustled the oak leaves overhead. No one spoke for a long time. Because if Emily had managed to break free from that grave, then the story didn't end with Richard Hale driving away into the night. It meant something else had happened in those woods. Something no one had ever imagined. And somewhere between that desperate struggle beneath the earth and the second grave, where her skeleton had eventually been found, another person had entered the story. The scratches in the dirt walls of the grave changed the entire shape of the story. Until that moment, investigators had believed they were reconstructing the final hours of Emily Carter's life. A terrible crime. A panicked killer. A shallow grave hidden beneath oak trees. But the marks carved into the soil told a different story. They told investigators that Emily Carter had fought. Hard. Hard enough to claw through packed earth with bare hands. hard enough to reach upward through darkness toward the surface. The forensic team worked in silence around the excavation site, measuring each scratch, photographing the grooves before the fragile dirt walls could collapse under exposure. The marks were unmistakable, parallel lines spaced like human fingers, cutting upward through the compact soil. They stopped just inches from the surface. Detective Daniel Ruiz stared at them for a long time. She got out. One of the forensic specialists said quietly. No one argued, because the evidence suggested exactly that. Emily Carter had not died inside that grave. She had escaped it. But then came the question that now haunted every investigator standing in that quiet field. If she escaped, what happened next? The team widened the excavation area, expanding outward from the original burial pit. Soil was sifted carefully, layer by layer, searching for any trace of what might have occurred after Emily reached the surface. And within an hour, they found the first sign. Footprints. Or rather, impressions. The shapes had long since hardened into subtle disturbances in the soil, faint depressions that had survived beneath layers of fallen leaves and compacted dirt. Forensic analysts began mapping the pattern carefully. There were two sets, one smaller, one larger. The smaller impressions were erratic, uneven spacing, dragging marks, as if someone had been stumbling, weak, barely able to move. The larger set appeared more stable, deliberate, approaching the grave site from deeper within the woods. Ruiz crouched beside the impressions. The map of the forest spread across the hood of a nearby vehicle. Someone had been walking through the trees that night. Someone who arrived after Richard Hale left. The investigators began tracing the path of the footprints. The smaller ones, presumably Emily's, moved away from the grave in a crooked line, weaving between trees as if she had been disoriented. Barefoot. Fragments of dried blood appeared on several stones along the path, tiny reddish stains preserved by the mineral surface of the rocks. She had been injured, probably badly. The trail continued for about 30 yards. Then it stopped, because that was where the larger footprints intersected it.
Ruiz stood slowly.
Whoever this was, he said quietly, they found her. The team followed the direction of the larger impressions. They led away from the original grave site toward the second location where Emily's skeleton had been discovered. The distance between the 2 points was roughly half a mile. Through dense brush. Across uneven terrain. The kind of journey that would have been nearly impossible for someone injured and exhausted after clawing their way out of a grave. Which meant one thing. She hadn't walked that distance alone. The forensic team continued scanning the ground. Near the midpoint between the two locations, they discovered another disturbance in the soil. A wide depression surrounded by broken branches. Ruiz approached slowly. The ground there looked as though something heavy had been placed down then lifted again. Someone carried her, one of the investigators murmured. The theory fit the evidence. Emily escapes the grave. She staggers through the woods. And then someone finds her. But the story still had two possible directions. The unknown person might have helped her. Or they might have finished what Richard Hale started. The second burial site waited silently beneath the trees. Investigators returned to the grave where Emily's remains had been found weeks earlier. Forensic teams reopened the site, examining details that had seemed insignificant during the first excavation. And slowly, the evidence began to form a darker picture. The skeleton had been positioned differently from the first grave. The body had been laid carefully on its back. Arms crossed across the chest. That kind of placement rarely happens during hurried burials. It suggested time, deliberate action. And there was something else. The soil layers above the skeleton showed clear signs of a single burial event, meaning the body had only been placed there once, which meant the second grave was not the original one. Someone had moved Emily Carter after she escaped the first burial. But whether she was alive at that moment remained impossible to determine. Detective Ruiz returned to the command center that evening with a heavy feeling growing in his chest. The evidence board now contained two timelines. The first timeline followed Richard Hale's confession. Emily opens the door. Struggle. Abduction. Blood in the car. Burial in the woods. Hale drives away. But the second timeline had begun forming beside it. Emily wakes. Emily claws her way out. Emily escapes the grave. And then someone else enters the story. Someone who walks out of the darkness of those woods. Someone whose footprints approach the grave at exactly the moment Emily Carter stumbles free. Ruiz studied the board in silence. For 23 years, investigators believed the Carter case had one suspect. One perpetrator. One monster. But now the evidence suggested something far stranger. Another person had been there that night. Another person had encountered Emily Carter in those woods. And that person had never come forward, which raised a chilling possibility. The unknown individual might have been the last person to see Emily Carter alive. But there was one more detail investigators hadn't shared with anyone yet. Because when forensic teams examined the bones recovered from the second grave, they found something unexpected. A fracture. High on the back of the skull. The kind caused by a heavy blow. Not by a fall. Not by the struggle inside the car. But by something else. Something delivered with force. Ruiz stared at the report for a long time. Because the injury had occurred after Emily escaped the first grave. Which meant the person who encountered her in the woods had not been a rescuer. They had been something far more terrifying. They had been the one who ended her life. The fracture on the back of Emily Carter's skull forced investigators to confront a possibility no one in Maple Ridge had ever imagined. For 23 years, the town had believed the monster responsible for Emily's disappearance was a single man. A predator who knocked on a door, dragged a girl into the night, and buried her in the woods. Now the evidence suggested something else. Two people had been in those woods.
Two.
Detective Daniel Ruiz stood in the dim light of the command center, staring at the enlarged photograph of the skull fracture projected across the investigation board. The forensic pathologist had been careful in the wording of the report. Blunt force trauma to the occipital region. Impact likely delivered by a solid object. In simple terms, someone had struck Emily Carter in the back of the head. Hard enough to kill her. But the timing of the injury was what made the entire case feel like it was shifting under everyone's feet. The break in the bone had occurred after the first burial. After the scratches in the grave walls. After Emily clawed her way out of the earth. Which meant that the man who delivered that fatal blow was not Richard Hale. Because according to every piece of evidence investigators now possessed, Hale had already driven away by then. The room buzzed with low voices as detectives worked through the implications. Someone else had walked into that field that night. Someone who found Emily Carter alive. And that person had never reported what they saw. Never called for help. Never told anyone that a terrified teenage girl had stumbled out of the darkness in front of them. Instead, that person struck her, killed her, and buried her again. The second grave suddenly felt far more deliberate than investigators had originally believed. Detective Ruiz leaned against the edge of the table, his mind racing through the possibilities. Was it another predator? A random passerby? Someone who discovered the scene and panicked? Or someone who had been following Emily long before Hale arrived? Each theory led down a different road. But the physical evidence only pointed in one direction. Toward the second set of footprints discovered near the grave. Forensic analysts had already measured them. Men's shoe. Approximately size 10. Deep impressions in the soil suggested a person weighing roughly 200 pounds. The stride pattern indicated someone physically steady and confident on uneven terrain. Not someone wandering randomly through the woods. Someone who moved like they knew the area. Ruiz studied the footprint diagrams again. The path approached the grave from deeper inside the forest, which meant the unknown man had not arrived by the dirt road where Hale abandoned the car. He had come from the opposite direction, from the heart of the woods. Investigators pulled satellite maps and forestry records from the late 1990s. Back then, the land surrounding the burial site had been used for scattered agricultural work and seasonal hunting. Old logging paths crisscrossed the region, many of them long forgotten by modern maps. One of those trails passed less than half a mile from the second grave. And the trail led somewhere unexpected. A small hunting cabin that had stood in those woods for decades. Ruiz leaned closer to the map. The cabin had belonged to a man named Thomas Weaver. Local records showed Weaver had owned the property since the early 1980s. Age in 1999, 52.
Occupation mécanique.
Address, Maple Ridge. The connection made the room grow quiet. Weaver wasn't just some stranger living deep in the forest. He was part of the same small town where Emily Carter had grown up. Detectives began pulling Weaver's background immediately. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. No violent criminal record. No major arrests. He had worked for years at an auto repair shop near the edge of town. Neighbors described him as quiet but friendly. The kind of man who kept a small vegetable garden and spent weekends hunting deer in the woods behind his cabin. But when investigators examined the timeline more closely, a disturbing detail appeared. On the night of July 12, 1999, Thomas Weaver had told his family he was staying overnight at the cabin. Hunting season hadn't started yet, but Weaver often used the place to get away from town, which meant something chilling. At the exact time Emily Carter escaped from that grave, another man may have been sitting in a cabin less than half a mile away. Detective Ruiz felt the weight of the discovery settle heavily in his chest, because that scenario created a terrifying possibility. Emily crawls out of the grave. She staggers through the trees, bleeding, terrified, barely able to stand. And somewhere nearby, a man hears something moving in the woods. Branches breaking. Footsteps in the dark. Maybe even a voice. The forensic evidence suggested Emily had moved about 30 yards before the larger footprints intersected her path, which meant the encounter likely happened quickly. Sudden. Unexpected. Ruiz imagined the moment. A man walking through the forest. A figure emerging from the darkness, covered in dirt, wounded, half-buried moments before. A girl stumbling toward him, trying to speak, trying to breathe. What would that look like in the dark woods of rural America? Something out of a nightmare. Maybe Thomas Weaver thought she was an attacker. Maybe he thought she was something else entirely. Or maybe he simply panicked. The problem was that Thomas Weaver had died 8 years earlier. Heart attack. Age 68. Which meant if he had encountered Emily Carter that night, he had carried the secret to his grave. Detectives drove to the cabin site the next morning. The structure still stood, weathered but intact. A small wooden building surrounded by tall trees and thick brush. Ruiz stepped inside. Dust coated everything. The table, the old hunting gear hanging from the wall, the rusted lantern sitting beside the window. But one thing inside the cabin caught the detective's attention immediately. Leaning in the corner near the door was an old wooden baseball bat. The surface was worn smooth by years of use. The head of the bat showed dark staining that had soaked into the grain long ago. Forensic teams photographed it immediately, carefully bagged it as evidence. And when the lab tested the old stains days later, the results sent a quiet chill through the investigation team. The bat contained traces of human blood. The DNA had degraded over time, but fragments of the sequence still remained. Enough to confirm something devastating. The blood belonged to Emily Carter. The quiet woods outside Maple Ridge suddenly felt different. Not just the place where a crime had occurred, but the place where two separate men had crossed paths with the same terrified girl on the same night. One man buried her alive. The other ended her life. Two strangers. Two terrible choices. And between them, a 17-year-old girl who fought her way out of the earth only to meet another nightmare waiting in the dark. For more than 2 decades, the town of Maple Ridge had carried a single question like a ghost that refused to leave. What happened to Emily Carter? The answer, when it finally emerged, was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Not one man. Two separate moments in the darkness of the same night. 2 terrible decisions that sealed the fate of a 17-year-old girl who should have been preparing for college, not fighting for her life in the woods beyond town. Detective Daniel Ruiz stood once more in the quiet field where investigators had uncovered the second grave. The earth had been carefully restored after the excavation, but the outline of the site still lingered faintly in the grass. Wind moved softly through the oak trees. The same trees that had watched everything unfold 23 years earlier. By now, the entire timeline had been reconstructed as clearly as the surviving evidence allowed. July 12, 1999. Evening settles over Maple Ridge. Emily Carter is home alone. A car waits outside. Inside that car sits Richard Hale, a quiet maintenance worker who had noticed the teenage girl weeks earlier at Ridgeway High. A man who had watched her from hallways and parking lots, slowly building the courage to approach. At 6:27 p.m., Emily photographs the vehicle through the front window of her house. Something about it unsettles her. Minutes later, Hale walks to the door and knocks. Emily opens it. The conversation begins awkwardly, awkward enough that she senses something wrong. Then comes the moment that changes everything.
A grab.
A scream. A struggle that spills into the driveway. And the car door slams shut. The vehicle disappears down Maple Ridge Road as the summer evening continues quietly around it. No neighbors know what has just happened. No one sees the car vanish into the growing darkness. 70 miles away, deep in the woods near an abandoned farm road, Hale digs a shallow grave beneath 3 oak trees. Emily Carter is still alive when he lowers her into the hole. She is injured, bleeding, barely conscious, but still breathing. Hale covers the tarp with dirt and drives away. And in that moment, the crime should have ended there. A terrible act buried beneath soil and silence. But something unexpected happens. Emily wakes up. In the darkness beneath the earth, her body finds the strength to move. Her hands begin clawing upward. The soil is packed and heavy, but adrenaline and terror drive her forward. Finger by finger.
In. She digs.
The scratch marks left behind in the grave walls still tell that story. The fight, the desperation, the will to live. Eventually, the dirt above her breaks open. Cool night air rushes into her lungs. And Emily Carter pulls herself out of the grave. Alone. In the middle of the forest. Wounded.
Disoriented.
Barefoot. She staggers through the trees, leaving faint traces of blood along the stones and roots beneath her feet. 30 yards. Maybe 40. Then something moves in the darkness ahead. Another person is walking through the woods. Thomas Weaver. A local mechanic spending the night at his hunting cabin nearby. Perhaps he heard the sound of movement. Perhaps he came to investigate. The exact moment of their encounter will never be fully known. But the evidence tells the rest of the story. Emily emerges from the shadows of the forest. Covered in dirt. Bleeding. Struggling to breathe. To someone seeing that figure unexpectedly in the darkness of a remote hunting trail, the sight must have been terrifying. Weaver was holding a wooden baseball bat, a tool he kept at the cabin for protection against animals. Maybe he shouted. Maybe Emily tried to speak. Maybe she simply collapsed in front of him. But something in that moment went wrong. The bat came down once.
Hard.
The blow fractured the back of Emily's skull. The injury was fatal. Whether Weaver realized what he had done in that instant will never be known. But the next decision he made sealed the silence of the case for the next 23 years. Instead of reporting what had happened, he buried her. A second grave was dug half a mile away.
Deeper.
More carefully hidden. The body placed on its back, arms crossed across the chest. The tarp re-wrapped around her remains. And the earth closed again. 2 graves. 2 men. 2 terrible chapters of the same night. Richard Hale lived with the secret of the first burial. Thomas Weaver lived with the secret of the second. Neither spoke. Hale retreated deeper into isolation, burying the memory beneath decades of quiet routine. Weaver returned to Maple Ridge and continued repairing cars, greeting neighbors, living an ordinary life while the truth remained hidden in the woods behind his cabin. Years passed. Search teams faded away. Posters disappeared from telephone poles. Emily Carter became a name spoken softly in the town's memory, a tragedy without answers. Until a forgotten disposable camera reopened the entire story. 1 photograph. A dark sedan beside a mailbox. A silent witness sitting behind the wheel. That single image cracked open a mystery that had slept for 23 years. And piece by piece, the buried truth emerged.
The car. The bloodstain. The grave.
the scratches in the soil, the second set of footprints, the baseball bat leaning quietly in the corner of a hunting cabin. Now, standing in the quiet field, Detective Ruiz looked out across the trees and felt the strange weight of closure that never quite feels complete. Because the truth of the Carter case carried something deeper than justice. Richard Hale had confessed. The law would deal with him. But Thomas Weaver had died years before the investigation uncovered his role.
No courtroom. No verdict.
Just a story slowly pieced together from fragments of earth and bone. Ruiz looked down at the ground where Emily Carter had finally been found. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. For 23 years, the woods had kept their silence. Now the story had finally been told. A girl opened a door. A car was waiting. A grave was dug. And somehow, against impossible odds, she fought her way back out of the earth. Only to discover that the darkness waiting beyond the trees could be just as cruel as the one she had escaped. Morning light drifted slowly across Maple Ridge the day the truth finally reached the town. For 23 years, the name Emily Carter had lived inside conversations that always ended the same way: a quiet shake of the head, a sigh, a sentence nobody could finish. She just disappeared. Now the mystery had an ending, not the kind anyone hoped for, but an ending nonetheless. The official announcement came from the county courthouse shortly after noon. Reporters gathered outside the small building, cameras pointed toward the podium where the district attorney stood beside investigators from the cold case unit. Detective Daniel Ruiz remained in the background. He preferred it that way. The headlines that evening moved quickly through television broadcasts and online feeds across the state. Teen disappearance cold case solved, evidence hidden for decades uncovered. The word spread through Maple Ridge like a shockwave. For older residents, the news reopened memories they had carried quietly for years. Search parties moving through the woods with flashlights, missing posters taped to gas station windows, candlelight vigils outside Ridgeway High School. For younger residents, Emily Carter had always been more legend than memory, a story parents mentioned when warning their children not to stay out too late. Now the story had become real again. Two names surfaced in the investigation's final report.
Richard Hale.
Thomas Weaver. Two men who had crossed paths with the same girl on the same night. Two men who had made decisions in moments of fear and violence that would echo through decades. Hale was formally charged with kidnapping and murder. His confession, combined with the physical evidence, the blood inside his abandoned car, the photograph placing him outside the Carter home, the burial site he described, left little room for doubt about his role in the crime. Weaver's name appeared in the report differently. Deceased. His involvement pieced together from forensic evidence and the blood-stained baseball bat discovered inside the hunting cabin. The law could no longer reach him. But the truth had finally caught up. Emily Carter's parents sat quietly inside their living room when investigators delivered the final timeline of events. The same house where their daughter had vanished all those years ago. The same living room where a lamp had once glowed beside an empty couch and a glass of soda left sweating on the kitchen counter. Detective Ruiz spoke carefully, explaining what the evidence showed. The knock on the door.
The car.
The first grave. The desperate struggle beneath the soil. And finally, the encounter in the woods. Emily's mother listened without interrupting. Her hands remained folded in her lap the entire time. When Ruiz finished, the room fell silent. The woman stared at the floor for a long moment. Then she asked one question. Did she fight? Ruiz felt the weight of that question settle heavily across the room. Yes, he said. The answer was simple, but the truth behind it carried enormous meaning. Emily Carter had not simply disappeared into darkness. She had fought. She had clawed through the earth with her bare hands. She had stood up again in the forest night, injured and terrified but still alive. For a brief moment, she had beaten the grave meant to hide her. That detail mattered, because in the long shadow of the case, Emily had often been remembered only as a victim. But the evidence left behind in the soil told a different story. She had been a survivor, for as long as her body allowed. Weeks later, the town held a quiet memorial at the edge of Ridgeway High School's football field, the same place where Emily once watched Friday night games with her friends. Students lit candles along the bleachers while teachers and former classmates gathered beneath the stadium lights. Many of them had grown older, moved away, started families. But they returned for that evening. Because for 23 years, the Carter case had been part of the town's identity, a wound that never quite closed. At the center of the field stood a small memorial plaque. It carried only a few simple words. Emily Carter, 1982 to 1999. She fought to come home. The wind moved gently through the stadium as the final candles flickered in the darkness. Detective Ruiz stood near the back of the crowd, watching quietly. Cold cases are strange things. They live in boxes and evidence rooms, waiting for someone to notice the one detail everyone else overlooked. In this case, it had been a disposable camera. One forgotten roll of film. One photograph taken by a girl who sensed something wrong outside her window. That single image had reopened an investigation buried by time. And piece by piece, it led detectives through decades of silence until the full story emerged from the earth itself.
The car, the blood, the graves.
The scratches carved into dirt by desperate hands. The truth had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of time and soil. Now, as the candles slowly burned down and people began drifting away from the field, the town of Maple Ridge carried a different kind of silence. Not the silence of unanswered questions, but the quieter, heavier silence that comes when the answers finally arrive. Emily Carter's story would always remain part of the town's memory, not only because of the crime that took her life, but because of the fight she left behind in the darkness of those woods. A fight that proved something simple and unforgettable. Even buried beneath the earth, she never stopped trying to live. Years passed after the case of Emily Carter was finally closed, but in Maple Ridge the story never truly settled into the quiet place where solved crimes are supposed to rest. Because some endings bring peace, and some simply replace one haunting with another. At first, the town tried to return to normal life. The courthouse case files were sealed and archived. The wooded field where Emily had been found slowly healed under layers of grass and fallen leaves. The hunting cabin that once belonged to Thomas Weaver was eventually torn down by the county after the land passed to a distant relative who wanted nothing to do with the property. But the story had already become something larger than the crime itself. It had become part of the town's identity. Students at Ridgeway High School still learned about the Carter case during safety assemblies. Teachers spoke about it carefully, reminding teenagers about caution, about trusting instincts, about the dangers that sometimes hide behind ordinary faces. And every year on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, someone left flowers near the old mailbox outside the Carter home. No one ever saw who placed them there. But every July they appeared. White lilies. Her mother once said they had been Emily's favorite. Detective Daniel Ruiz moved on to other investigations, other files stacked high on metal shelves in the cold case unit. Yet the Carter case lingered in his thoughts in ways most solved cases did not. Because the deeper he studied it, the more unsettling one truth became. Emily Carter had nearly survived. That was the detail that returned again and again, like a quiet echo inside his mind. If Thomas Weaver had not been walking those woods that night, if Emily had stumbled a few yards farther toward the dirt road, if a passing truck driver had seen her emerge from the trees, the entire story might have unfolded differently. A girl pulled from the forest, a kidnapper caught within hours. A town spared 23 years of questions. History sometimes turns on the smallest, cruelest coincidences. And in Maple Ridge, that coincidence had been a mechanic carrying a baseball bat through the woods at the wrong moment. For Weaver's family, the revelation had been devastating. His daughter, who now lived 2 states away, released a short statement through a lawyer after the investigation concluded. She described her father as a quiet man who loved fishing and working on engines, someone who never raised his voice in the house, someone who tucked her into bed when she was a child. The idea that he had played a role in Emily Carter's death shattered the image she had carried her entire life. But investigators never claimed Weaver was a monster in the same sense as Richard Hale. The evidence suggested something more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing. A terrible decision made in panic. A moment where fear overcame reason. A moment that turned a frightened man into the final link in a chain of tragedy. But the law cannot measure panic after the fact. And the truth remains buried inside a moment that lasted only seconds in the dark woods. Years later, hikers occasionally still visited the trail where the graves had been discovered. Not because it was marked as a memorial, but because the story had spread across the country through documentaries, podcasts, and true crime programs. People wanted to see the place where the impossible had happened, where a girl dug her way out of the earth, where she walked again beneath the trees, and where her journey finally ended. Most of them described the same feeling when they stood there. A strange stillness in the woods. Not frightening, exactly, but heavy, as if the forest itself remembered something. One autumn evening nearly a decade after the case was solved, Detective Ruiz returned to Maple Ridge while visiting relatives nearby. He drove the familiar road without planning to stop. But when the line of oak trees appeared in the distance, he slowed the car. The field looked ordinary now. Grass, wind, the distant hum of insects. Nature had reclaimed everything. Ruiz stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the edge of the trees. The forest path was still faintly visible, though many of the old tracks had faded over time. He stood there for several minutes without speaking. The cold case that once filled entire rooms of evidence had now become history. Yet something about the place still carried a quiet gravity. Because the Carter investigation had revealed something that investigators rarely discuss out loud. Most crimes involve clear lines. A victim, a perpetrator, a single story that explains everything. But sometimes the truth is stranger. Sometimes a life crosses the paths of two separate people capable of terrible choices. And the result becomes a tragedy that no one could have predicted. Emily Carter's story would always carry that strange dual shadow. One man who buried her alive. Another who ended the fight she had already begun to win.
Two separate acts tied together by chance.
And between them, a teenage girl whose last moments were spent refusing to surrender to the darkness around her. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, Ruiz turned back toward his car. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, whispering softly through branches that had witnessed everything but spoken nothing for decades. Somewhere beneath that soil, hidden traces of the past still remained, particles of dirt once disturbed by desperate hands, fragments of a night that changed the lives of everyone in Maple Ridge. Cold cases rarely reveal their secrets easily. Sometimes they sleep for years. Sometimes they wait for a single overlooked clue. And sometimes the truth emerges in ways no one expects, long after the people responsible believe the world has forgotten. But the earth remembers. The soil remembers. And in the quiet woods outside Maple Ridge, the story of Emily Carter would always remain. A reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the human instinct to survive can burn with astonishing strength. Long after the headlines faded and the investigation files were sealed, the story of Emily Carter continued to echo quietly through Maple Ridge, like a memory the town could never quite set down. Time moved forward as it always does. New families moved into the neighborhoods where search volunteers once gathered. Children rode bicycles along Maple Ridge Road, passing the same mailbox where a frightened 17-year-old girl had once raised a disposable camera and captured the photograph that would one day solve the mystery of her disappearance. Most of them didn't know the story, but the older residents always did. Because some nights, when the air grew still and the streets emptied after sunset, the memory of that summer evening in 1999 seemed to drift back across the town like a faint echo. Emily Carter stepping toward the front door. A knock. A stranger waiting outside. And a car idling quietly in the driveway. For years after the case was solved, journalists and documentary crews continued arriving in Maple Ridge, chasing the strange, haunting elements of the story that had stunned investigators across the country. A cold case reopened by a forgotten photograph. A girl buried alive who somehow clawed her way back to the surface. Two men connected to the same tragedy without ever meeting. True crime writers called it one of the most unsettling investigations of its era. But for the people who lived in Maple Ridge, it was never just a story. It was a life that had once existed among them. Emily Carter had walked the halls of Ridgeway High School, laughed with friends in the cafeteria, waited in line at the same gas station convenience store where everyone bought snacks after football games. Her absence had left a quiet hollow inside the community that no explanation could completely fill. Even now, decades later, some of her classmates still remembered the small, ordinary details about her. The way she tied her hair back during volleyball practice. The notebooks covered in doodles she carried from class to class. The habit she had of humming softly when she thought no one was listening. Those memories remained far stronger than the violence that ended her life. And perhaps that was the one part of the story the headlines never captured. The investigation had revealed every terrible moment that happened in the woods beyond Maple Ridge. But it had also reminded people of something else. Emily Carter was never just the victim at the center of a cold case. She was a teenager who had dreams, plans, and a future she believed was waiting for her just beyond the horizon of graduation. That future was taken away in a chain of events no one could have predicted. Yet the final truth of the case carried one powerful detail that investigators never forgot. Emily Carter did not simply vanish into the darkness. She fought. She fought against the earth itself. The marks in the soil told that story better than any report ever could. Finger grooves carved into packed dirt. Scratches running along the walls of a shallow grave. Evidence of a desperate struggle that proved something extraordinary about the human will to survive. For a moment in the woods that night, the impossible had happened. A girl buried alive refused to accept the ending written for her. She dug upward. Toward air. Toward light. Toward life. The tragedy of what followed could never erase that moment of courage. And in Maple Ridge, people remembered it that way. Not as the final chapter of a cold case, but as proof of the strength that lived inside a quiet teenager who refused to surrender. Every July, when the anniversary of Emily's disappearance arrived, someone still left white lilies near the old Carter home. The flowers appeared early in the morning before most of the town had woken. No one ever claimed responsibility. Some believed it was a former classmate. Others thought it might be a neighbor who had joined the search teams all those years ago. But no one asked too many questions. Because the gesture had become a quiet tradition. A small reminder that the town had not forgotten. One summer evening, nearly 30 years after the crime, a group of teenagers gathered near the football field at Ridgeway High School. They were too young to remember the investigation. To them, the Carter case existed only as a story passed down by parents and teachers. Yet when they walked past the small memorial plaque placed near the bleachers, they paused for a moment. The words engraved on the metal had weathered slightly with time, but they were still clear. Emily Carter, 1982 to 1999. She fought to come home. The teenagers stood silently for a moment before continuing across the field. The sun was setting behind the stadium lights, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere beyond the town, the woods remained as they always had, tall, quiet, and patient beneath the evening sky. Nature had erased the graves. The trails had faded. The hunting cabin had disappeared. But the memory of what happened there would always linger in the story of Maple Ridge. Because certain moments leave marks that time cannot fully erase. A photograph taken through a window. A shallow grave beneath 3 oak trees. A girl clawing her way out of the earth. And a town that spent 23 years searching for answers buried beneath the silence of the forest. Cold cases often end with numbers and evidence files. But this one ended with something deeper. A reminder whispered quietly through the years that followed. Even in the darkest moment imaginable, when the weight of the world presses down like the soil of a grave, the human spirit can still rise. Emily Carter proved that. And in the quiet town where her story began, that truth would never be forgotten.